So Michael is going live with a new rating system on Thursday.
Oh, that's exciting. Very timely.
Yeah.
Welcome. We appreciate that you're here. We're going to give everybody just a minute or two to join us. I'm Ruth Watkins from Strada Education Network, and you are here for a webinar. How can we best measure student outcomes? And I believe that is our last panelist, so that's awesome. Everyone is here. I think we're going to give folks just maybe a minute or so to join us. I'm watching the list of participants. So appreciative that you're here with us. Thanks for taking the time to learn with us at Strada Education Network. We are delighted that you're here.
Thanks for having us.
So this little bit of silence is just to make sure everybody has a chance to get on the webinar, and we're giving people just a minute to do that, but not long. So stay tuned. Hello, welcome. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us this afternoon. I'm Ruth Watkins from Strada Education Network. We are delighted that you're here. We expect a lively dialogue around measuring student outcomes beyond completion of credentials and degrees, and really thinking about what we are doing as a field to measure, capture, and meet the expectations and demands of many students and families. So just call your attention to the chat, and we have a note there about a little bit of housekeeping work. So we want to just let you know to take a look at that. If there's, if you have a desire for a recording later, there's a way to get there. And we are just delighted that you're here with us. So I think we'll begin. I'm Ruth Watkins from Strada Education, and grateful for your presence, and even more grateful for your active participation. There's a lot of opportunities to be part of this discussion. You may use the chat and the Q&A, so please do. We've got colleagues watching for us. We have a great discussion ahead today. Just a couple comments to get us going. Like many of you, I've worked in higher ed for a long time, and for so long, I focused a lot of my time, attention, and effort on completion, and really trying to move the needle on the students who came and left with the degree that they came for. What we are learning is that although it is essential, completion alone is insufficient. Students and families want to know what they can expect from a degree or a credential. What will happen to them beyond completion? So we're here for a lively discussion today. We can take a minute there, Andrew, and look at our panelists, and I want to tell you what's ahead, and then we're going to get right on to the discussion. So in this webinar, we will hear from Jen Engle, Director of Data at Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Michael Itzkowitz, Senior Fellow for Higher Education at Third Way, and Ted Mitchell, President for the American Council on Education. Remarkable visitors with us today. We're going to begin the conversation with Andrew Hansen, giving a little background and context and data as the Senior Director of Research at Strada Education Network. Thanks again for being with us. Andrew, take it away.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks to everyone joining us today. Since World War II, we've experienced three horizons in higher education. First with the college access movement, then a movement to raise our sightlines beyond access to completion, especially college degree completion over the past few decades. And then within the past decade, really a focus on the outcomes of a broader and more diverse set of learning experiences than degrees alone. And as you said, Ruth, the outcomes movement has really been motivated by the reality that many individuals who complete post-secondary credentials do not realize the promise of economic security, prosperity, upward mobility, and fulfillment. And so as the interest in outcomes has gained momentum, the question has been, how do you measure success? which outcomes, which metrics matter. And what we've seen is that there's really more than one way to cook an egg. And we're really fortunate to have three of the leading organizations and individuals who have, for many years, put a great deal of thought and effort into, thinking through these questions. And we, of course, want to acknowledge the many other organizations that you see here who have been working to advance this work in the field and thinking about this broad spectrum of outcomes. Some of the outcome measures that we've seen include learning, job placement, underemployment, return on investment, which Michael has done some tremendous work on, earnings, socioeconomic mobility, civic engagement, subjective well-being, fulfillment, loan repayments, and so on. And it's important to note that some of the work has integrated non-degree credentials and programs, but there are still substantial gaps in coverage there. And there are also noteworthy differences on the best time horizon for which we ought to measure outcomes. So now for the fun part, to tee up our conversation, I'd like to share with you the results of a national analysis that we published today. And we'll only have time for a snapshot, but I encourage you all to visit our website and dig into the details. So in this analysis, we're looking at the intersection of two core measures, economic outcomes and fulfillment. And the economic outcomes measure that we're using is an earnings threshold of 20% more than the median high school graduate, which is roughly equivalent to 200% of the poverty threshold for a family of four, or $48,000 annually. And all of our earnings data are adjusted for cost of living. Fulfillment, on the other hand, is measured by alumni's agreement with the statement, "My education helped me achieve my goals." And fulfillment is really a unique lens through which Strada has been examining outcomes that's motivated by our desire to include students and learners in our work and to value their perspectives. With that, let's dig into the analysis. So first, we have a national overview of the interaction between earnings and fulfillment. And we see that 58% of alumni meet both of these standards in the top right, 11% who met neither standard in the bottom left, 17% who met the earnings threshold but not fulfillment, and then 14% who felt fulfilled by their education but didn't meet that earnings standard. We did look at this by the type of post-secondary program they completed, including graduate, bachelor's, and associate degrees, as well as non-degree credentials and training, which includes sub-baccalaureate certificates, professional licenses and certifications, and technical training. And a couple of notes on this chart and the rest of the charts that I'll present. The x-axis represents the share of alumni who experience fulfillment from their education. The y-axis represents the share of alumni who met the earnings threshold, and the size of the bubbles reflects the relative sizes of the populations. So what we see here is that graduate and bachelor's degrees really stand head and shoulders above sub-baccalaureate education, both in terms of earnings and fulfillment, but that associate and non-degree programs really hang together. We looked at this by occupation across programs as well, and this is one place where I think fulfillment really adds an interesting dimension to our understanding of outcomes. Graduates employed in education, legal, community service, and arts occupations, for example, are less likely to meet the earnings threshold, but are notably similar in terms of fulfillment to graduates who are employed in higher wage STEM, management, business, and finance occupations. We looked at this by BA major as well, and here we see sort of similar patterns specifically with respect to education majors. That is, education majors are substantially less likely to meet that earnings threshold, but experience similar rates of fulfillment to higher wage majors such as business, health, and computer science. All of that to say just that fulfillment really provides a unique lens and insights into those lower earning fields, such as education, social work, psychology, and so on, that are delivering to some extent what students are seeking. Next, we look at the outcomes by gender and program type, which is indicated by the color of the bubbles. And here you see, I want to just call your attention to two things. One is that gender-based gaps in earnings get smaller as education increases, and two, that gender-based gaps in fulfillment are smaller than the gaps in earnings. We looked at this by race, ethnicity, and program type, and here we see that there are substantial differences in earnings and fulfillment among white and Asian graduates on the one hand, and Black and Latino graduates on the other. And those gaps exist across degree programs, but the largest race-based gaps are for bachelor's degree holders. Finally, we think that there are, of course, many actions that can be taken to advance our understanding of outcomes and ultimately improve them. So for policymakers and funders, there are definitely opportunities to develop standards and frameworks for measuring outcomes, as well as investing, developing, and connecting data systems, and ultimately promoting outcomes transparency. And of course, have to acknowledge the leading edge work that Jen and Gates have done in partnership with IHEP and others over the past several years that she'll tell us more about. For all stakeholders, we want to emphasize the importance of being able to disaggregate these outcomes by field, by program of study, occupation, gender, race, ethnicity, and family background. And for education and training providers, really being able to pull in both administrative data, existing administrative data sets, as well as alumni survey to understand both the economic and fulfillment dimensions of outcomes for your graduates, and finding ways to leverage that information to improve policy and practice. There's, of course, a lot more to say about that topic, and I'll leave that to our conversation. With that, thank you. And Jen, I'll pass the baton over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Andrew. Really excited to be part of this panel today to talk about such an important topic. You know, are we making good on the promise that post-secondary education is a pathway out of poverty? We had the opportunity here at the Foundation to explore this question with 30 thought leaders in the field as part of the Post-Secondary Value Commission, including Ted Mitchell, who is one of our esteemed commissioners. We released the final report and an interactive data tool last year. You know, when we started this work 3 years ago, we were, and we still are, quite concerned about the trends that we're seeing in the data that show while post-secondary education is really critical to achieving any kind of economic mobility in this country, the increasingly high costs for students, coupled with still too low completion rates, is putting the surest route out of poverty, out of reach, especially for students of color. I think everyone here on this panel would agree that's simply not an acceptable outcome for our post-secondary education system, and yet it's the reality facing far too many of today's students. Now, when we started the work on the commission, we were focused squarely on equitable economic returns, given our concerns about widening income inequality and wealth inequality. But the commission and the field very rightly pushed us to broaden our scope. And so if you see and look at the definition, the value definition and the value framework, you'll see that it emphasizes both economic and non-economic value to both students and society. I want to briefly share with you the definition of post-secondary value developed by the commission. Students experience post-secondary value when provided equitable access and support to complete quality, affordable credentials that offer economic mobility and prepare them to advance racial and economic justice in our society. So the value equation is not just a function of what students earn after they leave. It starts with whether they go to college at all, what they study when they get there, how much they have to pay, how long it takes them to complete, which affects how much they have to pay, whether they complete, and then what they earn. The bad news, unfortunately, is that there are race, income, and gender disparities at every step along that pathway. The good news is that what institutions, states, the feds do matters a lot in terms of being able to address these disparities. So in my last minute, I just want to briefly describe the threshold framework the commission created for measuring post-college earnings outcomes. These thresholds range from minimum economic return, which takes into account the cost that students pay, to economic mobility, to economic security, which includes wealth. Many of these thresholds build on prior research in the field. So Michael's work at Third Way, the College Board, the Georgetown Center, Chetty's work at Opportunity Insights. Really, we were trying to create a framework that brought these different concepts of value together in a cohesive way to help support the next phase of research and action on this really important topic in the field. I don't have time to go into our findings, although perhaps in the questions, but they're really consistent with other similar measurements, like the work that Michael's done or Chetty's done. And what these studies find time and again is that there's hundreds of institutions where students do not earn enough to recoup or repay their investment. Many of these students are students of color and low-income students, and most of them are not supported through to the completion of the credentials that they sought, despite paying tens of thousands of dollars to attend before dropping out. So no matter how you measure it, I think that's not the outcomes that we want for today's students. So I will now pass it off to Michael to talk about his work.
Hey everyone, thanks for having me. My name is Michael Itzkowitz, and I am president of the Higher Education Advisory Group and also a senior fellow at the think tank Third Way. Appreciate you all being here. I guess the question is, why are we all here and talking about this today? And I've been doing this research for a while, and one of the things that really caught my eye after I left the Department of Education, where I was director of the college scorecard, was just the massive amount of federal student loans and grants that get put into higher education every year. Of course, I think a lot of us would like there to be more money, but as I started doing a research, I kind of thought, there's a way to use this most effectively and efficiently. And unfortunately, the research that I was doing, unfortunately, shows that some students are actually even left worse off after they attend specific institutions. So at first I was looking at completion, and then I started to look at this question of value and what kind of value are institutions providing students nowadays. Today, the number one reason why I did that is because it is the top reason why students often attend college, is because they want a more economically secure future. So of course they want a return on investment. So one of the ways that I had approached this a few years ago was thinking about the price that they pay relative to the earnings boost that they're getting. It's something that I call a price to earnings premium. You all may be familiar with the term price to earnings if you've read about the stock market at all, but I wanted this to become a concept that was just as easily understandable for people that are choosing a college, as is oftentimes one of the biggest decisions that folks will make. And it's oftentimes a decision that they'll only make one time. It's not like going to a grocery store or going to your favorite fast food chain, for example, where you know what kind of food you're going to get and the quality that it's going to be. So the way that a price to earnings premium works is I actually look at the price that students pay out of pocket. So this is after all grants and scholarships are deducted. It's what they're actually paying, whether that's through personal finances or loans. And then I look at the earnings boost or premium that they get after they attend a specific institution. And the way that I define that is the amount of money that they earn in comparison to the average high school graduate with no college experience in their state. So if the average high school graduate earns $22,000, but someone at North Carolina Greensboro earns $32,000, their earnings premium would be $10,000, as they're making $10,000 more than someone in their similar age range that never went to college. And using these two numbers, it allows us to calculate the average number of years that it takes students to actually recoup their financial investment. So the way that works is just using a fictional example of ABC University. If it costs $20,000 a year out of pocket to attend and complete a bachelor's degree in 4 years, it would cost them $80,000 over the course of those 4 years out of pocket to obtain that bachelor's degree. But if they're also earning a $10,000 premium by attending ABC University, they're able to use this $10,000 premium to recoup this $80,000 within 8 years, right? It's $10,000 a year extra, and it costs them $80,000. Therefore, 8 years later, they've recouped their cost to earn their actual credential. So while doing this work, I think that we should talk about some really promising news, is that most institutions, specifically 63%, allow the majority of their students to recoup their educational investment within 5 years or less. I think that all is, reaffirms it, or at least reassures a little bit, that college is still worth it a very high percentage of the time. Unfortunately, within my research, which I think mimics, Jennifer and other people's research on the panel, is that we did find that 14% of colleges within our sample, or 442 institutions, actually left the majority of students earning even less than the average high school graduate, 10 years even after they've enrolled within the institution. Now, we've continued to build upon this work, and it's evolved over time. So there's been program level data out. These are students that have done every single thing right. They've paid their tuition, they've got their credential, whether that be a certificate, an associate's, or a bachelor's degree. And then we're able to look at their earnings a few years out, 2 or 3 years out, to see, are they now earning more than the average high school graduate? And what we saw is that about 46% of all college programs do allow students to earn more than this threshold and recoup their educational investments within 5 years or less, so still very promising. But we also saw that 16% of all college programs and all college graduates, these are students that have done everything right, are still earning less than the typical high school graduate. So we've had some other iterations of this work, and I think we'll get into them, but just quickly, one of the things that we're also able to do is look at the price to earnings premium for low income students, to specifically look at the cost that they're paying relative to how much of an earnings boost that they're getting. And what I found when looking at the best ROI for low income students, I was very excited about this work to figure out where they're getting the best ROI across the country. And after I ran this analysis, I saw that the places where low income students are getting the best ROI were schools like Duke University, Stanford, where I believe my former boss Ted may have went to, University of Chicago, and Harvard, and perhaps Yale. So I saw this list of best ROI for low-income students, and I was like, that's amazing, Mike, you just recreated the US News rankings. Congratulations, way to go. But then I also had this number, the percentage of Pell Grant students that were next to them, and I saw that each of them was below 20%. They each enrolled a very low percentage amount of low and moderate income students. So to build upon that, I actually took, this low income, ROI, and I placed a percentage on it, and then I indexed that, and I actually multiplied it by the percentage and proportion of Pell Grant students that each school has, and I created something called the Economic Mobility Index. So what happens when you take these two factors into account? Schools like Harvard dropped from number 4 in terms of ROI for low-income students to number 847 in terms of economic mobility. University of Chicago dropped from number 8 to number 860. And who rose to the top? They were actually 10 Hispanic serving institutions in places like New York, California, and Texas that were the top of our list, and also HBCUs, which are almost non-existent in US News rankings and other college rankings. There were 7 in the top 100 in terms of delivering on your promise to low and moderate income students. So as mentioned, we're sort of just evolving in this work. I'm hoping to continue to evolve, and I think that we're all thinking deeply, and some of the folks that are thinking deeply is the person next on my panel, which is Ted Mitchell, and they're doing a lot of work at ACE. So I will hand it off to Ted.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Jen. Thanks, Andrew. And most of all, thanks, Ruth and Strada, for pulling this group together. A great audience we have today. Look forward to the questions. I want to start, Andrew, by talking a little bit about what's different about the work that you guys have done, because I think it's very important. As Mike mentioned, at ACE, we're hot in this work, have been for some time, but many of you may know that the Carnegie classification system has traditionally not utilized social and economic mobility or success of students post-graduation as a factor in classifying institutions. In collaboration with the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, ACE is now responsible for righting that wrong and creating a classification system that includes social and economic mobility, as well as the composition of the programs that institutions measure. You'll remember R1, R2, and so on. I'm really pleased and grateful, Ruth, that Strada has stepped forward and been such a strong supporter of that work, and look forward to working with everybody to pull it off. That is to say, we don't have the answer yet, but thanks to Jen's work and the work of the Value Commission, all of the work that's been mentioned, we believe that within a year we'll be able to have a classification system picks up on where Mike was. Who are the institutions that are going to surprise us? Because they have done a terrific job over time in promoting the social and economic mobility, upward mobility of their students. And so we're doing that work. I want to come back, Andrew, to what makes the Strada work special. And I think that that's the effort to move away from just economic factors into some of the socioeconomic factors, some of the psychosocial factors that are so important. We always talk about civic engagement. We talk about the benefits of living an engaged, thoughtful, reflective life. And the fulfillment index, if you will, that you guys have created is really quite important. And I think is a new insight that builds on Strada's work, Strada alone and Strada and Gallup's work over the years. And I think it's really important for us to look at that. And I think that in pointing out the difference between economic outcomes and psychosocial outcomes, and showing that there's a difference in some of the helping professions, some of the human services professions, you remind us that while certainly getting a job that helps build a middle-class lifestyle is critical, that there are other outcomes to education as well. So thank you for doing that. The other thing that you pointed out, and I want to refer people back to, I think, your very first graph where you talk about the 3 horizons of higher education. And I think many of us have sort of lived through or surfed, if you will, I'm in California today, surfed through those 3 waves. And I think it's important to remember that although we move from one to the other, we're never really finished with any of them, right? And so while we think today, and we're drawn to a discussion about student success beyond graduation, we need to remember that the issues of access and affordability are still with us. That one of the real problems, I guess, FAFSA rates are increasing this year, which is great news. But one of the things that we've come to understand over the last several years is that too many low-income first-generation families of color have basically said higher education is out of our reach. It's out of our reach because it's not affordable. It's out of our reach because it's way too complicated. It's out of our way because the game is rigged. There are all kinds of reasons behind that, but that, for me, is a problem that we need to work on every day, because if those students and those families are not choosing higher education, they can't receive the price to income benefit that Mike was talking about. They can't get the fulfillment growth that we see in those graphs. And so we still need to work on access and affordability. We still need to work on persistence and completion. Anybody who is in the marketplace and sells a product and 50% of the people who come into the store leave without buying it strikes me as an unsustainable business. But as Jen pointed out, and Andrew, you as well, we end up with a completion rate that is embarrassing for the nation and really does cut into the ability of higher education to move the needle. Last thing I want to say is I want to pick up on what Mike noted as the good news. I think that if you go to the the bubble graph that shows, for those of us who can see it, the bubble graph that shows graduate, bachelor, associate, and non-degree, and looks at that curve going northeast through the educational pathway, and to look at especially the bachelor's degree, which is the focus of so much attention. The bachelor's degree continues to provide economic outcomes well above the 50% mark and fulfillment outcomes well above the 50% mark. So I think that for the much maligned place of higher education in the lives of not only young people, but adults seeking higher education, we're still doing the job that we've set out to do. But as the study shows, and as Jen's work, and especially Mike's work, have demonstrated, the variability of that is something that we need to worry about. And I think that's where I want to end, is that, well, the aggregate news is good, very interesting on the fulfillment side. It's the disparate outcomes by major disparate outcomes by institution, and most importantly, disparate outcomes by race, ethnicity, and gender that need to continue to trouble us and cause a focus for our work.
Thank you so much, Ted, and thank you all. Remarkably cogent comments from panelists and our senior researcher, Andrew Hansen. So the thing that ties us all together, that brings us here today for all 500-ish people that are on this call, is that very call to action, that desire that Ted just talked about. We want better outcomes for more people, particularly equitable outcomes. So now let's talk about that a little bit. How do we get there? First question, and I'd love it if everybody who wants to weigh in does. Who do you see as the user of these various tools, of these various metrics that you're all part of developing? Individuals, their parents, working learners, institutions, policymakers. Maybe everybody does one use case. I would love that.
From our perspective at the foundation, first and foremost, the work of the commission is meant to support institutions in their work to support students. At the end of the day, many low-income students of color, don't have a lot of options about where they go to college. And so we need the colleges that serve low-income students and students of color to improve, and giving them the data they need to identify gaps in access, cost, completion, and post-college outcomes is a critical part of their efforts to improve programming, supports, and curricula for their students. So first and foremost, we see institutions as the primary audience. And then transparency is really the other piece, because that's, as we saw the evolution of the college completion movement, we saw that having both new data to interrogate college completion and equitable college completion, along with transparency of that data, helps support a broader movement around it.
Great, thank you. Anyone else want to comment? So we've got institutions as top of the list.
I'll double down on institutions. I think it's quite important, and I think if you think about the way Michael presented it a little bit ago, if I'm the president of institution A and I see that people in my program, one of my programs, are underperforming people at institution B, that gives me a question to ask, a worry to have, and hopefully a model to look at, or at least some ideas of where to go to look to improve my program. And so I think institutional leaders will be advised to take a look at this. But I want to add to that and cheat a little bit, Ruth, by saying that one of the ways that institutional leaders are influenced is by the transparency of data and information to the broader public. And so I guess I would say institutions plus the consuming public of parents and families who can certainly put some pressure on institutions to pay attention to these data.
Very good. And maybe, Michael, that might have been where you were leading. Do you want to comment at all?
Maybe institutions and oversight committees would be the one additional thing that I would add. So for example, there's an accreditor, a college accreditor who's up for review this week. And one of the schools that they accredit, their students have a 4% first-time full-time graduation rate. That school received $170 million last year, but they're accredited. 89% of their students are first-time full-time. So it's not a lot of part-time, it's a very high majority of their student body. And Ruth is looking around like, how could this exist? I think that we're all kind of wondering the same thing. And that kind of goes to policymakers, and this helps students too, by using this information effectively to make sure that, to provide a level of assurance that when students sign up for a federally approved institution and they're taking out taxpayer dollars in the form of grants and loans, that they know that they're going to get at least a minimal return on their investment, right? Like that is a very small threshold that I think me and others are talking about here. And, I saw a low level of fulfillment on some of the art majors, just as an example, but I do wonder if art majors, they were also very low on the salary scale. And there seemed to be a correlation. I wonder if art majors were making as much as engineers, if their fulfillment might jump a little bit. That's just a broad assumption on my behalf. And in terms of institutions, as Ted mentioned too, I think that this is a dive deeper, a dig deeper sort of indication. It's a flag. You have, let's just say that you have a large community college and you're the president. You have 50 programs. You can see that 40 of them are working really well. 5 are okay, and then 5 are showing no economic ROI. They're actually leaving the majority of students earning less than the average high school graduate. But they enroll most of your students. This gives you an opportunity to dig deeper to say, is it the program itself? Is it the curriculum? Or are we offering a program that has no jobs within the geographic region that we're offering it, right? We're oftentimes behind in higher ed, where we should have the ability at this point to at least start forward thinking. And I think that this data allows us to begin to get there and change that narrative. And as you mentioned, students, we need students to be able to look at certain colleges and make better decisions. We're starting to promote this data. It's very difficult, but there's a hope and a push and a nudge that media is kind of highlighting good places, not only in terms of, just ROI, but ROI for a lot of students, the most students across the nation who are not upper class. They often come from the middle class. So there's new data coming out. There's schools that are doing a really good job, and hopefully that narrative will continue to move in that direction.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask you one more question, and I think all of you should weigh in briefly on it, and then we'll jump on to the chat and the Q&A, because there's some great questions in there, and really appreciate those questions. Keep them coming. We'll answer as many as we can, and those that we don't get to today, we'll get to you personally. So let's imagine that we get 3 years from now or 5 years from now, and the new methodology of Carnegie classification has been implemented, and Ted's been wildly successful with his team in that effort. Michael and Jen are carrying on with their work, as is Andrew. So if we played it forward, and we have on this call today many, many leaders in different roles at institutions, what advice do you want to give them today about what they could do to have better outcomes 3 and 4 and 5 years from now? Because we don't really want to wait. We want to give advice for folks about what do we know about what makes a difference to today's students as they look forward. And what would you advise institutions to learn about themselves and to do now during this time?
I'd love to start by sharing some experience that we've had with the University of Texas system. They were participants in the Post-Secondary Value Commission's work and put their data forward to be tested against this new framework, because their leadership is really committed to understanding whether they are producing equitable outcomes by race, by income, by gender, by program. And as a result of that initiative, as I mentioned, we released a public data tool, did what we could with college scorecard data against the framework, but there's also a section of the website that shows the UT data, which breaks this down in many different ways. And what has been so encouraging is not only were the UT leaders brave enough to put their data out there when no one else is reporting this information right now about their students and their campuses, they have been undertaking a really concerted effort to try to unpack and understand the data. So if students aren't reaching threshold 0, which is, taking into account, are they earning more than a high school graduate plus enough to recoup their costs within 10 years? If they're not, why not? Is it because they're not completing? That's typically the first factor. Sometimes they are completing, but it's taking them so long to complete that cost that gets added to that threshold is too high a bar for them to pass in any reasonable time frame. So how do you start to think about accelerating their progress to their credential? And then they're also starting to map it back to learning outcomes within the actual courses that students are taking. Why should it be that Latino students and white students have different earnings in year 1 coming out of the same engineering program at the same school? What in both the curricular as well as extracurricular activities, thinking about internships and other ways that students can develop social and cultural capital that help them navigate from college into the workplace. And so they're really doing that hard work of unpacking from the data how it links to the practices that they're implementing on their campuses and what they can change so that they can see an improvement in those outcomes. So I think, really providing support to institutions to develop the capacity to use data in these ways, and to encourage leadership to really lean into the conversations that these data help provoke about what might need to change to support students better.
And I'll just jump in here, Ruth, because I think there's such alignment with the work that Jen and you all are doing with institutions and our own work as well. We've, over the past several years, piloted an alumni survey working with more than 70 institutions now, led by my colleague, Nicole Torpi-Sabo. And I think as we think about the next 3 years, really encouraging institutions to pull in the outcomes that you can get from administrative data, which are largely, financial, economic in nature, and for that reason, a bit easier to measure and more robust. But really, alumni surveys are one of the only ways you can really get at this fulfillment piece. But the beauty of surveying your alumni, of course, is that you can connect it back to effective practice areas that have promise to actually move the needle on outcomes. And so that's really what we see as the power of it. And so we're thinking about practice areas such as, financial supports, work and learn coaching, high quality coaching, as well as work-based learning as some of the potential areas for institutions to really lean in to drive those outcomes, because that's ultimately what all of this is for. Although to come back to the previous question, I really do think this question of users is a both and conversation. I mean, there's just the beauty of data, building out data systems and information tools is that, virtually all the stakeholders in this space can leverage those to drive outcomes if we're all kind of set, have our vision focused towards that same goal. And so there are use cases. I've seen some really wonderful things, for example, done by the New York Times. When someone in the chat shared, I think, the upshot at the New York Times took Raj Chetty's data and built these, really amazing tools that I think have educated a lot of individuals, families, and so on, and placed increased focus on outcomes. And so there's certainly room to do that as more, though I completely agree. I think this is one area where there's complete consensus that institutions are first and foremost going to be the primary users, because they have the power to change the practices that are actually going to drive outcomes.
I'd love to just jump in here because there's a great question in the chat, and I'm going to ask this to you, Ted, as a veteran. What do you suppose we ought to do for all the leaders that are out there on this call who are saying there's faculty resistance on this discussion? Some of it might be about, let's not reduce all of our influence to economic outcomes alone. Point well taken. That's alive and well in this discussion today. What insights and thoughts do you have about how this new approach to the Carnegie classification will land on faculty and the perspectives faculty will bring to it, and how we begin to help our faculty colleagues see how very important this is to students, families, industries, and the public in general?
It's a great question, and thanks for being kind and saying that I'm a veteran and not just that I'm old, which is also true. So, I think, Ruth, that there is always an interplay between how the faculty see the development of the academic enterprise and how others, including students and families, see the enterprise. And I think that the revision of the Carnegie classification will put at the front of the mind of everybody, including faculty leaders, the importance of creating positive student outcomes around social and economic mobility. I think it's been there. I think it's underground. Every faculty member I know who pushed not very hard will say, yeah, that's exactly right, and we should be doing that, and we should be doing more of it. I think where it gets hard is some of the things that Andrew was saying about, well, how do we get there from here? particularly as we know that the professoriate is nowhere near as diverse as the student body, that the faculty is older and less responsive to what's happening in today and tomorrow's economy. And so I think we've got some mismatch, and we need to build scaffolding for faculty and for administrators and others to be helping students think about high impact practices that we know work to increase the retention and success of low-income students of color. It has to do with good advising. It has to do with creating internship opportunities, spot grants to help them overcome very moderate economic needs. The work that our colleague Gail Mello did at LaGuardia Community College with the ASAP program is a great example of how one does that. But just sort of left with do it to faculty is not helpful. I think that it's incumbent on administrators to create a plan and a program that faculty can buy into and deploy, rather than simply falling back and saying, you do it.
Yeah. Do we think there's a role here for employers?
I think that there's an obvious connection between employers and institutions. And I'll just use one example of how institutions can leverage employers to make good decisions. So I was just listening to perhaps a webinar, if anyone's familiar with those, a couple months back, and it was the new president of Miami-Dade College. And they were talking, they're predominantly a 2-year institution. I think 98% of their degrees or something like that are 2-year degrees. They've always been like that. I'm in South Florida. They're about 45 minutes down the highway here. And they were talking about offering a couple of 4-year degrees. I think that they offer teaching and they offer health. And the way that they came to this decision, as one example, is they're only offering 4-year degrees where there is a need within the community that they're offering. So it's really partnering with business and industry within your geographic region to understand what's needed and what's not when thinking about expanding programs. And their program graduates within that area are doing extremely well because they are providing supply to that demand. So I just wanted to give that one example, anecdotal example, how folks can leverage that community.
That's great. Thank you.
For me, Ruth, really quickly on employers, I think a few areas I see are, number one, being true partners with post-secondary education providers in terms of offering work-based learning opportunities, finding places there. Number two is figuring out ways to, simplify and automate reporting mechanisms so that employers can actually give us the data that we need, such as occupation, job title, hours worked, and these kinds of things, to have a more nuanced understanding of the economic outcomes as we think about developing data systems beyond where they are today. And then the third piece I would say is being clearer in the actual skills and experiences than they have been in the past, using generalized terms, which I think makes it very difficult for education and training providers to meet those employers' needs. So I'd say those 3 things.
Great, thank you very much. Well, can
I add one
Yes.
to that, which brings in a new domain, is that I think that leaders across the country are understanding that they've undervalued their career centers. And I think that career centers have the potential to be a really great interface between the employer community and the university. I think that from the employer side, they will have experiences with career centers that need to be part of the feedback to institutions about the performance of students and their viability in the job market. And on the other hand, I think that we really undervalue the role of career centers in helping people think about their prospective jobs within the context of the economy where they want to place themselves, whether that's the local economy or a distant economy, but to really help provide the counseling, the support, and some of the social capital development that students need as they move into the world of work.
Let's pick up on that social capital conversation, because there's a lot of people who've weighed in on the Q&A on this particular issue. So we have a significant number of Americans that don't perceive post-secondary education as feasible for them, either affordable or possible. And they also believe that that good job is out of reach for them. And we also have this accurate perception that networks and social capital and what you know and who you know actually does make a pretty big difference if we don't intervene. So I think I would like to talk just a little bit about what you see happening in our landscape that helps individuals build and access that social capital, that helps them get to those outcomes beyond completion that we're all hoping for every one of our students.
I think one of the patterns that we see in data, like from various student surveys, is that students of color, low-income students, and first-generation students are routinely less likely to access what are often referred to as high-impact practices. So that can mean deep engagement with faculty, which is one way to build social capital and network in your field. They are less likely to undertake internships, often because they are unpaid or underpaid. And they don't necessarily have the same connections to employers who may not be recruiting at the schools that Michael's identifying that are both highly diverse, but graduating their students. And are they going to those schools, or are they going to the schools on the list, on the first list that Michael developed, instead of the list of schools where they're both diverse and graduating students? And so that does put some onus, I think, on the employer community to be looking for diverse talent in different places than they are now.
Great. Anybody else want to comment on the social capital network building element of a better outcome?
I just want to double down on the idea of some of these high impact practices, and in particular the engagement with, we know so much about the importance of the engagement oftentimes between a student and a single individual in the university, whether it's a faculty member or an administrator. And I think we really need to make, and that's not the advisor you're assigned to your first year. It's a person who really can become a mentor as well as a push the button advisor. So that's one. But I think we've really come to appreciate paid internships as a way of breaking through a lot of the mustiness of sort of just a go to class, come back, go to class, come back. And I think that that's a very, very important tool for all of us. And one of the ways in which employers can be brought into the mix in important ways that support their work as well as supporting students.
Yes, I think that's a really good shout out there, Ted. And I'm just going to go ahead and admit or confess some of my own failings as an institutional leader here. Because so often as a dean or a provost or a president, we talk about the great possible experiences on our campus, and we hold them up all the time. And here's what I know from looking at the data, that 80% of those great experiences are consumed by 20% of my students. And
Right.
It's not equally distributed. In fact, the students who have faced the greatest barriers are the least likely to access those great experiences. So a challenge for all of us is to imagine what changes we make in our institutions and in policy. I mean, you could imagine this reaching all the way to policy, where we said every part of taking Title IV Pell dollars is going to be getting a paid internship for every Pell recipient. That's the sort of thing that would change outcomes for more individuals and lead to more equitable outcomes. Of course, doing it is another matter entirely, but I'm glad there's about 500 really smart people who participated in this call who can think about that. Because I know if we keep doing it the way we have, we will not get there. This requires something different. So on that,
Ruth,
yes,
can I? Mike, go ahead.
And just in terms of equitable outcomes, there are substantial funding disparities that do exist between institutions across the United States. And I think that the economic mobility work that some of us are doing is going to give a better indication of folks that are actually delivering on that promise, but may not be featured in the New York Times every single day. For example, I think the Harvard was mentioned in the New York Times about 100 times more than the word community college. just as one example. But, we have different opportunities to use economic mobility data for whether that be public policy, but also for different funders to think about what's working and what can be scalable. And tomorrow we're actually coming out with a paper at Third Way that you can access that looks at economic mobility from the work that I've previously done, but also ties federal financial aid to different tiers of institutions based off of the type of mobility that they provide. So I think that this is really just a starting point, and we will continue to evolve, but we're hoping to begin that conversation and hopefully highlight these schools that have been delivering on the promise for years and years, but now we have the data to better validate the outcomes that they produce.
Hey, Ruth, can I take us back to your great suggestion about Pell Grants? And just, I think I'm probably saying this to 500 people who agree, but I'd like us to just be direct about it, which is that a lot of these high impact practices that Jen started us off on and that you've reinforced, they do come at a price. The price is really important. And it oftentimes needs to come up against other priorities of an institution. One of the things that we're hoping to do in the Carnegie classification work is to put a spotlight on those choices. That there are choices to make about whether you provide institutional resources for paid internships or more advisement or a computer system that helps catch people before they fall. All of those things are really important, and we hope that helping institutional leaders see that there are trade-offs will help more of them make trade-offs that will support student success. And then on the policy side, let's also remember that a lot of these high impact practices are labeled by some as administrative bloat. And it's a place for sort of radical honesty, is that that's not administrative bloat. That's the kind of support that students need in order to succeed. And that pays off in enormous benefits to individuals and to society. So it is another ROI concept, but one that we don't often talk about.
So well said. And I think we would probably even be more compelling in making that argument if we figure out how to deliver equity with those high impact practices. There's a challenge for the day for all of us. And because what you're hearing here is a strong message that those equitable outcomes beyond completion of a credential or a degree will be facilitated by those high impact practices delivered more equitably. There's so many great threads in the conversation, and I want to just pick up a couple of them as then we go to kind of final comments from anybody who wants to offer them on this panel. There's a lot of support that I'm reading in the Q&A around challenging all of us not to measure only economic outcomes. Of course, that is a critical floor, and we want to consider fulfillment, meaning, and purpose in work, even as we take, I think, very seriously this point that a foundational outcome has to be that economic lift. So, point well heard. Listening to everyone who's got ideas about how to capture personal fulfillment. I think a second thing that's been lively in the Q&A is discussion about skills and non-degree credentials and certificates, and expanding our view and measurement in that area, I think will be important. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in on that. But I guess if I were to ask our really, really talented, remarkable panelists today, I would say, what words of wisdom would you like to offer as you look at this movement? So we looked at our wave of access, and we know we have to keep on it. And of course, for individuals to realize the benefits that they entered into in post-secondary ed, they have to complete. And now we're adding yet another wave of movement here, and a conscious effort to deliver outcomes, tangible outcomes beyond completion of a credential or a degree. So as we look at our colleagues across the field, a little bit of wise advice for them. What do you panelists, Andrew, wise folks, see on the landscape, and what would you like to suggest to this group listening in today?
I'd like to back up Andrew's comment, which is we need better and more data. The only reason we're able to have this conversation is because data like what's now available from the scorecard became available several years ago, and we've been able to interrogate that data in new ways. that data is highly limited. It's not actionable enough for the institutions that we're identifying that need to be able to support their students better. And yet we don't have a comprehensive data system that links post-secondary outcomes to workforce outcomes for every student in every program and every institution. Institutions have to negotiate access to this data, whether it's through the Census Bureau or their state labor department. And that is not going to help institutions improve these outcomes if they can't get access to student level data to really target their response.
Jen, we might have to let you have the last word because I'm doing the high sign, but let me just say there is a strong, compelling argument for accessible, accurate data that can help us all perform better. Thank you, remarkable panelists. We appreciate your time, your effort, and for everyone who took the time to be part of this conversation, we're grateful for you. The recording is available, the slides are available, and I think they get emailed to everybody who signed on today. So thank you all, and may we join together in better outcomes beyond completion. It's a worthy cause. Thank you.